Right, now, the sense of outrage at Kirstie Allsopp yesterday, of course, who is the presenter of a programme called Location, that all broke yesterday after we went off air, where she basically said how enraged she was when people claimed they could not afford a home. Principally, she was talking about first-time buyers and essentially said, if you don't take your EasyJet holiday, you don't have your latte, admittedly they're about $3.50 each, don't go to the gym, dump the Netflix, you'll be able to save for a house, which kind of left me a little bit torn, because you do need a saving culture and sacrifice culture, don't you? But equally, it kind of missed the point about what's happened to the housing market since maybe when she first bought a house and when I first bought a house, for sure. But it's not just first-time buyers, of course, who she was principally talking about. And that's the angle I wanted to look at this morning. And I'm very pleased to welcome a guest, Andy Coley, self-employed trainer, joins me this morning. Andy, good morning to you.
Good morning, Nick. How are you?
Very well indeed. Now, I know there's been a sense of outrage about what she said. I mean, as I said, I'm torn. I think actually you do have to sacrifice. You do have to make savings. But we all need an achievable goal, don't we? And obviously, it's a very difficult marketplace out there for people, but not just first-time buyers. Tell us your experience.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I'm in my mid-40s. And I was lucky enough in my early 20s to be a house owner when I met my first wife. She had a house already when I met her, and she had scrimped and saved, and she'd done everything that Kirstie said, hadn't gone out anywhere, hadn't done anything, was employed. But her first house was £45,000 when we lived down in Portsmouth. And it was much more achievable. The wages weren't that different to what they are now. And so therefore that ability to be able to buy a house is much easier. I looked up the house prices, knowing I was going to come on here now. That same house is £250,000 now.
And how long ago? How long ago was that when you bought it?
That was 1995 is when she bought the house, and it was the sort of 4 or 5 years later that I met her, that we got married. And we moved house again later on, and we were able to afford that house. We went up to the next stage, but unfortunately that marriage didn't last. We were married for 11 years in total. So then in my mid-30s, I was that 33, 34-year-old moving back home with my mum and dad with nothing. I walked away from the house thinking, okay, at least if she's still got the house, that's what happened when we met. That would be me satisfied with that. We didn't have kids. And so essentially I had to start life again as a divorcee, with all the sort of the debt and the other stuff going on mentally for me, suffering with depression and all sorts of things.
So you're in your mid-30s at this point, and I presume, having been there myself, not a lot of savings either.
No, more debt than savings. Let's put it that way. I was still working. I was still able to do my job. But at the same time, I recognised that the rut that I was in, I really needed to do something to kind of get out of that rut. And that's, for me, became my focus in my mid-30s, about shifting and changing, doing something different so that the rest of my life wasn't going to be the same as it had been. That was really my focus.
So how tough was it for you? Did you ever get back in the housing market? Have you been a lifelong renter since then? And what were the offers from the mortgage companies? Were there even any offers to the mortgage company?
No, I mean, so far, with still some debt hanging around from back then, with the fact that I've moved from the South Coast up to London. So when I met my wife now, she was already living in London. She'd been living in London for a while. She was a renter. And we were quite fortunate. Our rent was fairly cheap. I'm in South East London near Lewisham. And the rent that she was paying was fairly cheap at the time. And we're just having to look at being renters. We can't realistically move away from the area because I've got a stepson now, and so she had a son, and we can't move away because we move away. His other family are in London. His school is in London. The agreement is that we are in London, and so therefore, even though we've got 2 daughters now, and we would love to live where my family are, in the West Country, to be closer to support, because in London we have no support. We're both self-employed. We both work for ourselves. We have no support other than what we pay for.
Well, let me ask this, and again, I don't know the answer to this one, but as self-employed, are you effectively freelancers, or do you run it through a service company? And what do the mortgage companies say to people like you, 35 years old, not a lot of savings, but self-employed? Has it become harder to get mortgages because you are self-employed?
Yeah, I mean, so we both have our own limited companies. So we both are on our own salaries, and we pay ourselves dividends and so forth. But that comes with its own complications. You know, my wife was able to get a little bit of furlough during lockdown. I wasn't able to get any. If I didn't work, I don't earn. And if I'm not earning, you can't get a mortgage. And so therefore proving income against dividends is really complicated. It is doable. I mean, I have friends who have done it in the same circumstances, but it's really tricky. I'm sat in a house that's worth, I would have to, that's worth £600,000-700,000 right now that I'm renting. I could never buy this house. I'd never get a mortgage.
What do you make of Kirstie Allsopp's comments? I mean, obviously, you would have gone, well, it's not just about first-time buyers, it's about people like me, and there's many of you. But what do you make of her comments generally? Do you join the general trashing of them, or do you think maybe life's changed? Maybe not everyone's wish is to own a house?
Yeah, I mean, I've certainly resigned myself to not owning a house for a while, and I'm quite happy with that. I think they're an oversimplification. I think you're right. I think if you cut down on every bill and you save and you look at your bills and you look at all the things that you can control, then you can definitely save some money. But I was looking at that, if you want to put a deposit on this house, right, and I had a £20 a week coffee habit that I cut, it would take me 97 years of saving that money to just get the deposit together. I mean, I might live to 100 because I'm not drinking so much coffee. The point is, just to get the deposit together would take me 97 years. That's let alone the mortgage on top itself. So I think realistically, that's so difficult. And asking people to move further north or to move away from their support structure or their family or their environment or their clan, it's just not realistic.
You see, and I'm conscious of time here, but it's very interesting. When I was young, it was the 80s. It was very different. They were chucking money at us from the banks. We didn't have big salaries, but I could get 5 times my income with my wife at the time. But to afford a house even then that remotely wanted, I had to move all the way from South London up to Huntingdon, which at the time was about 60, 70 miles away from London. As about as far north as I go. But even then, people were commuting from as far as York. So, I mean, that was the mentality then. Do you think there's a lack of willingness to do that now, or is it just not even reasonable with the transport costs, maybe?
That's a big factor. So when I lived in Portsmouth, I used to work in Fleet Street in London for one of the big banks. And so I was getting some days on the 4:20 train, so I'm quite used to this time in the morning, to get up to London for a 7 o'clock shift to take over from the Asian banks and doing the work that I was doing at the time. So I was doing that commute, but it killed me. And it cost so much money even back then 20 years ago. So I think now, if I think about how crippling that would be on top of the wages, which probably haven't gone up that much.
Absolutely, yes. Andy, listen, thanks very much for sharing your story. A different angle on the Kirstie Allsopp comments. I can see lots of tweets